learning outcomes. This module shall enable you to learn and understand the following: Introduction to World Trade Organization, History of World Trade Organization, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, that is a Uruguay Round and World Trade Organization, Marrakesh Agreement, Features of World Trade Organization, Structure of World Trade Organization, Objectives of World Trade Organization, Functions of World Trade Organization, Ministerial Conferences, and lastly Doha Development Round. Introduction. The World Trade Organization was formally constituted on January 1, 1995 as an international organization. It made a successful transition from the negotiation approach of GATT, which was simply an informal device to handle international trade since 1948. GATT was temporary in nature, whereas WTO is a permanent organization legislated as an outcome of Uruguay Round of GATT 1986-94. It has around 153 members. Its formal languages are English, Spanish and French, with its headquarters in Geneva, Switzerland. It's responsible for governing the international trade system among member nations. It is a means to achieve further liberalization of international trade, that is, to make global trade trouble-free and more favorable for member countries under an institutional framework. History of WTO. WTO was established on January 1, 1995. However, its origin is almost 50 years ago. Its forerunner, the General Agreement on Tariff and Trade, called GATT, was signed in 1948 with 30 member countries. Its main purpose was to set trade rules to remove impediments like tariffs to international trade. It was believed that these protectionist policies would increase poverty, unemployment and inequality along with political instability. Thus, GATT's main goal was to enhance smooth movement of goods by lowering tariffs. But over time, international trade became more complex and countries switched to using non-tariff barriers. GATT was confined to set rules which oversee trade in goods only and did not cover wider areas like trade in service, subsidies, investment, intellectual property rights, etc. This problem resulted in beginning of another round of negotiation known as the Uruguay Round, which extended from 1986 to 1994 with over 120 countries participating in it. This round touched upon all spheres of modern global trade, such as trade in goods and services, trade in agricultural goods, intellectual property rights, safeguards, subsidies, investment and dispute settlement mechanism between member countries, and finally led to the formation of WTO, the GATT Uruguay Round and the World Trade Organization. A variety of matters were covered during the Uruguay Round. These included trade issues majorly. The central issue is reduction of trade barriers on agriculture commodities. The center stage was taken by agriculture trade. This marked the beginning of this issue as a major one. Other issues that were included in the arbitration for the first time were trade in services, trade in textiles and clothing, international investment, international property rights, and lastly, reinforcing the organizational structure of GATT. The round concluded in late 1993 with an agreement. New universal guidelines were established and the World Trade Organization was created to replace GATT after consequent ratification by the United States in December 1994 and by other participating countries. Even when GATT-UR Accord does not do away with all trade distortion, it is significant. The proposal the US initially made was sought to phase out all agriculture trade blockages and distortions. However, the final agreement was not able to achieve its goal. Marrakesh Agreement. Manifested by Marrakesh Declaration, the Marrakesh Agreement was signed in Marrakesh, Morocco on 15th April 1994. It marked the culmination of the 12-year-long Uruguay Round and established the World Trade Organization. On January 1, 1995, it officially came into existence. It was also supported by numerous other agreements on issues including trade in services, sanitary and phytosanitary measures, trade-related aspects of intellectual property and technical barriers to trade. The agreement developed out of the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. A new, more productive and lawfully mandatory means of dispute resolution was also established. No entity could be party to any one of these agreements without being party to them all. Hence, the various accords which make up the Marrakesh Agreement are a combination of an indivisible whole. Features of the WTO. The distinguishing features of the WTO are: WTO is a legal body, whereas GATT was just an informal body. Unlike the International Monetary Fund, that is IMF, and the World Bank, WTO is not a representative of the United Nations. There is no weighted voting, but all the members in WTO have equal rights. The agreements under the WTO are undeviating and equally compulsory to all member nations. Its dispute settlement system is an automatic, quicker and binding mechanism on all members. Unlike the GATT, WTO covers various issues like trade in goods and services, intellectual property rights and several other issues. Finally, WTO is a joint entity with a large organizational structure. Thus, it is an extremely powerful body. Structure of WTO. The WTO has around 153 members, which accounts for over 97% of the global trade. All judgments are taken by member countries on the ground of consensus. At the peak of WTO's organizational structure is the Ministerial Conference. It is the apex governing body which decides on all issues by meeting at least once after every 2 years. MC is represented by trade ministers of all member countries. Then next most important branch of the WTO is the General Council, which consists of all the senior members, generally ambassadors, who actually execute actions under the Ministerial Conference. They work through the WTO headquarters at Geneva. It is also obliged with the duty of settling disputes among members and to regularly review the trade policy. Some of the bodies mentioned below are accountable for their duty to the General Council. The Trade Policy Analysis Body. It consists of all WTO members. Its main objective is to periodically review the trade policies and trade activities of all member nations. It indicates how loyal member nations are to do their duty and suggests measures to make better the same. The Dispute Settlement Body. All WTO members are part of this body. Its main purpose is to implement WTO's agreements on dispute settlement and to improve the effectiveness of the dispute resolution process. It hears all disputes with the aid of permanent appellate body. Dispute resolution is compulsory and so is the final decision for all members unless changed by a full agreement of the dispute settlement body. The Council on Trade in Goods and Trade in Services. With the same members as above, it provides a machinery to watch over all the agreements on trade in goods and services. Also, in order to protect intellectual property rights, there is a council for the agreement on trade-related aspects of intellectual property rights. The Secretariat and Director General. The Secretariat's main objective is to provide directions on all aspects of the WTO. The Secretariat is not authorized to take any legal decision but can offer important advice. He is led by the Director General, who is appointed by the MC for a term of 4 years. Also, 4 deputy directors from all member states assist him in making annual budget estimates and financial statements of the WTO. These reports are then presented by the Director General to the General Council for the final approval. The Committee on Trade and Development and Committee. It was established in 1965. Its main objective in WTO is to concentrate on sustainable development issues related to trade. They do not negotiate on trade rules, but see how the WTO deals with sustainable development. Objectives of the WTO. The main objectives of the WTO are to reduce and eliminate tariffs and other barriers to trade, to improve living standard of people in the member states by raising world production of goods and services, to ensure that world resources are efficiently utilized, to conserve the environment and ensure sustainable development, to promote world trade so that every country gets benefit, to ensure that developing nations get more advantage from increasing international trade, to demolish all obstacles to an open world trading system so as to achieve fastest economic growth, and lastly, to increase competition among all trading partners so as to benefit consumers. Functions of the WTO. The major function of the WTO as mentioned in Article 3 of WTO are as follows. To eliminate discrimination in international trade by reducing tariff and non-tariff barriers. To provide norms for doing healthy international trade for member countries. To ensure a flexible organizational structure in order to properly fulfill the objectives of the WTO agreement. To provide a platform to member states in order to negotiate on further trade liberalization. Also, to cooperate with the IMF and the World Bank with the aim of establishing consistency in the trade policies. To ensure fast and effective trade-related dispute settlement process in member nations to ensure that world resources are efficiently utilized. And lastly, to administer trade policy analysis device. The Ministerial Conference. As said above, the apex decision-making body is the Ministerial Conference. Its meeting takes place once in every 2 years usually. It takes all the decisions on matters under any of the multilateral trade agreements and bringing together all its members. The roots of these conferences can be dated back to 1996 in Singapore, where all the important delegates from the field of trade, foreign, finance and agriculture belonging to more than 120 member governments and those in the process of acceding to the WTO participated. Concerns relating to the work of the initial 2 years of activity and the implementation of the Uruguay Round agreements were examined in the plenary meetings and various sessions. The Ministerial was hosted by the Singaporean government. Below, each one of them has been discussed in detail. Chart 1. Ministerial Conference in Singapore from 9 to 13th December 1996 and the second one in Geneva from 18 to 20th May 1998. Third in Seattle from November 30 to December 3rd 1999. Fourth in Doha from 9 to 13th November 2001. Fifth, Cancun from 10th to 14th September 2003. Sixth, in Hong Kong from 13th to 18th December 2005. Seventh, Geneva from 30th November to 2nd December 2009. Then 8th again in Geneva from 15th to 17th December in 2011. 9th in Bali, 3rd to 6th December 2013. 10th Nairobi, to be held from 15th to 18th December 2015. The first ministerial conference was held in Singapore from 9th to 13th December 1996. It recognized the legitimacy of the WTO provisions aimed to introduce new fields of arbitration and broaden the area of regulations. During this ministerial conference, 4 new issues of negotiations came up on trade and investment, trade and competition policy, clarity in government procurement and trade facilitation. The outcome was that labour standards, consonances of regional trade agreements were brought into existence. Geneva was the venue of the second ministerial conference. This conference was held during 10th to 20th May 1998. During this conference, financial crisis of East Asian countries was taken up. The Seattle Ministerial Conference was the third conference held during 29th November to 3rd December 1999. It was rated a failure due to large-scale street protests in Seattle. The people were unhappy and claimed that the policies of WTO were weakening environment, harming labor and human rights, lowering standard of food and product safety. Fourth Ministerial Conference was held from 9th to 13th November 2001 in Doha, Qatar. It has been one of the major ministerial conferences. It approved joining of China. Doha Development Round, also called Doha Development Agenda, focused on the needs of poorer countries, sustainable economic development, and reaffirmed the commitment to the foundation of multilateral trade and harmonious domestic policies. Transparency in international trade problems of developed and least developed countries was also taken up. Special treatment, work program, applications of the agreements, technical aid and increased participation of developing countries were the major issues. Cancun. Ministerial Conference, being the fifth conference, took place during 10th to 14th September 2003 in Cancun, Mexico. To take note of developments in negotiations and other work under the Doha Development Agenda was the main task. The issues which were unresolved and pre-planned strategies, understanding limited capacity, involved legal terminology, heavy agriculture subsidies, agreement between US and EU were the major highlights of the discussion. At the eve of the Cancun conference, a strategic move to eliminate agriculture subsidies and market excess product was declared, but the time was not specified for eliminating subsidies. Commitments on import tariff was rated a failure. No conclusion was drawn and no agreement reached on issues like agriculture access to the market and services. Also, not showing any seriousness on its own commitments meant that the US and European Union Pact was highly vague. During December 13 to 18, 2005, the Hong Kong Ministerial Conference was held in Hong Kong, China. During the 6th Ministerial Conference, progress was made on termination of subsidies on export of cotton, phasing out all subsidies on agriculture export and access to market for goods from the less developed countries. It was considered important for the Doha Round negotiations to move forward. Geneva hosted the 7th conference. It was held on the November 30th to 2009. The central line of agreement was WTO multilateral trading system and current global economic environment. Geneva, Switzerland, was again the venue of the 8th Ministerial Conference, which was held during 15th to 17th December 2011. Statements were prepared by the ministers in the different working sessions which were taking place parallel to the plenary session. The following were the themes: importance of the multilateral trading system and the WTO, trade and development, and Doha Development Agenda. The accession of Russia, Samoa and Montenegro were approved by the conference. The final session witnessed the passing and approval of a number of decisions by the ministers. 9th WTO Ministerial Conference took place in Bali, Indonesia from 3rd to 7th December 2013. Decisions aimed at aligning trade, allowing developing countries more options for providing food security, enhancing least developed countries' trade and assisting in development generally, collectively termed as the Bali package, was taken up by the ministers. Various other routine decisions were also adopted. Yemen was accepted as a new member. The 10th Ministerial Conference is to be held in Nairobi from 15th to 18th of December 2015. Doha Development Round. Among all the ministerial conferences, the Doha Round is considered of great importance. Tasks including negotiations for an array of issues relating to developing countries were set out. Hence, it is termed by few as the new negotiations, that is the Doha Development Round. The trading system between many nations in the WTA has made a significant contribution to economic growth, development and employment throughout the past many years. In the time of the universal economic slowdown, the WTO is determined to keep the process of reform and liberalization of policies of trade, making sure that the system performs its full part enhancing development, growth and recovery of these nations. Therefore, it strongly reaffirmed the goals and fundamentals set out in the Marrakesh Agreement, setting up the World Trade Organization and taking an oath to refuse the use of protectionism. Persons of the underdeveloped nations place their interests and needs at the core of the work program accepted in this declaration. They shall make continuous efforts to make sure that developing countries and especially the least developed among them get a part in the growth of world trade in tandem with the needs of their economic development given the preamble to the Marrakesh Agreement. 6 intergovernmental agencies involved in an integrated framework to help least developed nations increase their capacity to trade. Some additional preferential market access agreements were brought into being by a high-level meeting on trade initiatives and technical help for least developed countries before that in 1997. Fourthly, in 2000, new talks started on agriculture and services. These have been incorporated as a wider plan at the 4th WTO Ministerial Conference in Doha, Qatar in November 2001. Next, negotiations and other work on non-agriculture tariffs, trade and environment, WTO rules such as anti-dumping and subsidies, investment, competition policy, trade facilitation, fairness in state procurement, intellectual property and a range of problems raised by developing countries as hurdles they may face in putting up with the present WTO agreements under the work program have been added in the Doha Development Agenda. Summary. Therefore, we can conclude that the WTO is an international organization which deals with the norms for trade between nations. It has around 153 member states, which accounts for almost 97% of the international trade. Its headquarters is at Geneva, Switzerland. It has evolved from GATT, an informal body which was controlling international trade since 1948. However, over time, as trade complexities increased, the requirement of a formal body to establish an institutional structure to regulate global trade was realized in Uruguay Round in the period 1986 to 94, and hence WTO was established in January 1995. The main considerations of the WTO are to encourage member countries to reduce tariff and non-tariff barriers to trade. Besides this, it also focuses on trade in goods and services, agriculture products, investments, subsidies, etc. One of its main functions is trade dispute settlement among member nations. Also, in the organizational framework of the WTO, the Ministerial Conference is the apex decision-making body, which generally meets after 2 years to resolve on all matters related to multilateral trade agreements. So far, 9 ministerial conferences have been held, and the 10th ministerial conference will be organized in Nairobi from 15th to 18th December 2015. However, among all ministerial conferences, the Doha Round is considered of great importance since it covers several issues concerning developing countries. It is also termed by few as the Doha Development Round. The work agenda, that is the Doha Development Agenda, includes negotiations on non-agriculture tariff rate, trade and its impact on environment, WTO norms related to anti-dumping, subsidies, investment, competition policy, trade enhancement, intellectual property rights and many other issues put up by the developing nations as the problems they encounter in executing the current WTO agreements.